Many see the Battle of Midway as the main defeat of the Japanese Imperial Navy, but this assumption is wrong. Although Japan suffered a significant loss in June of 1942, they were far from a beaten force. The Imperial Navy retained substantial surface warship strength after Midway. In many surface categories, battleships, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers, Japanese units still outnumbered American forces in the Pacific theater. However, the strategic balance had shifted dramatically. Japan's crippling losses to carrier aviation and experienced aircrews at Midway, combined with America's growing industrial capacity, were changing the longer-term equation. Still, in terms of immediate surface combat power, the Japanese remained formidable. This reality would soon become brutally apparent to the United States Navy. The Americans were about to discover something that would shake their confidence to its core. Japanese warships, particularly their heavy cruisers, represented a force to be reckoned with. These vessels weren't just numerous. They were formidable fighting machines, crewed by sailors who had trained relentlessly for the very kind of combat that was coming. On the night of August 9th, 1942, the United States would experience one of the worst naval defeats in a single engagement of the entire war. This battle stands among the most devastating Allied surface action defeats of World War II, often compared unfavorably even to Pearl Harbor in terms of ships lost in a single night. Understanding what happened that night matters profoundly for grasping the entire Pacific War. This wasn't just another battle in a long campaign. It revealed fundamental weaknesses in American naval doctrine, communication systems, and tactical preparation. More importantly, it demonstrated that Japanese excellence in night fighting wasn't merely propaganda, it was deadly reality. The Battle of Savo Island would force the US Navy to completely rethink how it fought at sea. The path to this catastrophe began not with Japanese action, but with American ambition. Admiral Ernest King served as Commander-in-Chief of the United States Navy, a position that gave him authority over all naval operations. King was not a man known for patience or caution. From the very moment Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, King had been waiting impatiently for the opportunity to shift from defense to offense. Every day that passed with American forces on the defensive grated against his aggressive nature. But wanting to attack and being able to attack were two different things entirely. One massive obstacle stood in King's way: Japan's powerful Kido Butai carrier force. This was the same carrier striking force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, that had rampaged across the Pacific, sinking Allied ships and supporting Japanese invasions from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. As long as this formidable weapon remained intact and operational, any American offensive would face the threat of devastating air attacks from multiple fleet carriers. King knew he couldn't risk a major operation while this sword hung over his head. Then came Midway. In early June of 1942, American carriers met the Japanese fleet in a battle that would change the strategic balance in the Pacific. The decisive American victory destroyed the core of Japan's carrier strength. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, went to the bottom of the Pacific, taking with them not just irreplaceable ships, but hundreds of experienced pilots and aircrew. Admiral King watched these developments with keen interest, recognizing immediately what this meant. The ideal opportunity had finally arrived. With Japanese offensive carrier power shattered, King realized he could now seize the initiative. The question wasn't whether to launch an offensive, but where. King's strategic vision focused on the southern Pacific as the perfect starting point for America's counteroffensive. The geography made sense. Any advance toward Japan would need to secure these island chains, to protect the vital sea lanes connecting the United States to its ally Australia. The original plan that emerged called for retaking Tulagi, a small island where the Japanese had established a seaplane base back in May. Seaplanes might not have the glamour of carrier aircraft, but they provided crucial reconnaissance and patrol capabilities. Denying this base to Japan, while securing it for American use, would extend US air coverage significantly. The planning staff initially envisioned this invasion taking place in the fall, giving ample time for preparation, training, and assembly of forces. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley received selection as commander of the South Pacific Theatre, responsible for overseeing this operation. Gormley was a competent officer, but he would soon face challenges that would test any commander. The careful, methodical planning process that military operations typically require was about to be thrown into chaos. In early July of 1942, everything changed. American intelligence reports that had been accumulating through late June and early July coalesced into a disturbing picture. The information revealed that beyond the seaplane base at Tulagi, the Japanese had begun construction of something far more threatening, a full airfield. The location of this airfield made the discovery even more alarming. It sat across Savo Sound from Tulagi, on the larger island of Guadalcanal. This was terrible news for multiple reasons. An operational airfield on Guadalcanal would allow the Japanese to base land-based bombers within striking range of the critical sea lanes between America and Australia. These weren't the short-range seaplanes from Tulagi. These would be twin-engine bombers capable of carrying heavy bomb loads or torpedoes over considerable distances. Every cargo ship, every troop transport, every tanker carrying fuel to Australia would sail within range of these aircraft. The implications were staggering. If Japan completed this airfield and made it operational, they could potentially cut the maritime lifeline connecting the United States to Australia and New Zealand. Without that connection, Australia would be isolated, unable to receive reinforcements, supplies, or equipment. The entire Southwest Pacific would become untenable for Allied operations. General Douglas MacArthur's forces in Australia would be starved of resources. The strategic situation would deteriorate catastrophically. The Allies simply could not permit this to happen. The decision came swiftly. The operation would be expanded and accelerated. What emerged was Operation Watchtower, a plan more ambitious and more urgent than the original Tulagi operation. The objectives now included not just seizing Tulagi and its seaplane base, but also occupying Guadalcanal and capturing that airfield before the Japanese could make it operational. This expansion came with a significant problem. Admiral Gormley's carefully laid plans for a fall invasion were suddenly inadequate. The operation couldn't wait for autumn. It needed to happen immediately before Japanese construction crews finished their work on the airfield. The invasion date, originally set for sometime in September or October, got moved up to August. This might seem like a modest acceleration, but in military terms it was enormous. Gormley expressed serious concerns about this rushed timeline. Moving an invasion forward by 2 or 3 months meant that units wouldn't complete their training. It meant that equipment wouldn't arrive where it needed to be. It meant that detailed planning for landing beaches, naval gunfire support, air cover, and logistics would all be compressed into a fraction of the normal time. The Admiral wasn't being pessimistic. He was being realistic about the challenges of amphibious operations. Despite his reservations, the planning proceeded at breakneck speed. What should have taken months to organize was being thrown together in weeks. The operation became essentially improvised, cobbled together from whatever forces and supplies could be assembled quickly. Officers and men who should have trained together for months were meeting for the first time. Landing craft crews practiced their approaches to beaches they'd never seen. Supply officers scrambled to figure out how to pack and load equipment in the correct order for unloading. Yet, despite this tight schedule and all the logistical challenges it created, Operation Watchtower was deemed ready to proceed by the end of July. Ready might be too strong a word. Operational might be more accurate. The forces existed, the ships were available, and the basic plan was in place. Whether all these pieces would work together smoothly remained to be seen. On July 31, 1942, an armada began its journey toward the Solomon Islands. The amphibious task force consisted of dozens of ships of various types, transports carrying the assault troops, cargo ships loaded with supplies and equipment, warships to provide protection and gunfire support, and the precious carriers to provide air cover. Aboard these vessels sailed the 1st Marine Division, approximately 11,000 United States Marines who would form the initial assault force. Most of these men had never seen combat. They were heading toward their first test, toward the beginning of what would become a 6-month nightmare of jungle fighting. The Marines aboard those transports didn't know they were about to launch the first American offensive operation in the Pacific War. They didn't know that the island they were heading toward would become synonymous with some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. And they certainly didn't know that, in just over a week, the sailors protecting them would experience one of the worst naval defeats in United States Navy history. The voyage toward Guadalcanal proceeded without major incident. As the fleet approached the target area, weather conditions deteriorated significantly. Heavy clouds and periodic rain squalls reduced visibility to almost nothing at times. For the Marines packed into hot, cramped transport compartments, this weather made an uncomfortable voyage even more miserable. But for the operation's success, this bad weather proved to be a blessing. The poor conditions shielded the flotilla from Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. Patrol planes that might have spotted the fleet and raised the alarm were grounded or unable to see through the thick cloud cover. Japanese forces in the area remained completely unaware that a major American operation was approaching their position. This meteorological shield allowed the fleet to achieve something that would prove crucial: complete tactical surprise. On August 7, 1942, the weather cleared enough for the operation to commence. The American fleet entered Savo Sound in the early morning darkness, their approach still undetected by the Japanese. As dawn broke, the Japanese on Tulagi and Guadalcanal looked out to see a sight that must have shocked them: dozens of ships filling the sound, with more visible on the horizon. Before they could fully process what they were seeing, American naval guns and aircraft opened fire. The bombardment was intense, but relatively brief. Naval gunfire crashed into Japanese positions on the beaches and inland areas where resistance was expected. Carrier aircraft strafed and bombed anything that looked like a defensive position or troop concentration. Then, after this preparation, the first wave of landing craft headed toward the beaches. The 1st Marine Division was going ashore, beginning the first American offensive operation in the Pacific Theater. The landing operation split into 2 main efforts. One targeted Tulagi and 2 small adjacent islands, Gavutu and Tanambogo. The other headed for Guadalcanal itself. At 0800 hours, Marines hit the beaches at Tulagi and its neighbouring islets. What they encountered there would give them their first taste of what Japanese defensive tactics meant in practice. The fighting on Tulagi was brief but extraordinarily fierce. The Japanese garrison on Tulagi and the adjacent small islands consisted of approximately 1,500 men total, including naval troops and some construction workers who had been pressed into service as infantry. These men had received one simple order: defend the position to the death. And they followed that order with a determination that shocked even veteran observers. The Japanese didn't just fight hard, they fought until virtually every single man was killed. There were no mass surrenders, no white flags raised when positions became untenable. Individual Japanese soldiers fought from caves, from bunkers, from holes in the ground, until Marines killed them. Some Japanese troops made suicidal charges against Marine positions, choosing death in attack over death in defense. Others had to be burned out of caves with flamethrowers or sealed in with demolition charges. By the time Tulagi and its adjacent islets were secured, the entire Japanese garrison had been wiped out. They had fought, as they had promised, practically to the last man. Only a handful of Japanese soldiers were captured, most of them too badly wounded to continue fighting. The Marines had succeeded in taking their objectives, but at a cost. The brief but intense fighting resulted in 248 Marine casualties, dead and wounded combined. The situation on Guadalcanal itself proved dramatically different. When the Marines landed there, they discovered that the Japanese presence wasn't actually a regular military garrison at all. The island was occupied primarily by construction crews, labourers and engineers working on the unfinished airfield, with only minimal regular ground forces present at that moment. These men had no orders to fight to the death, no defensive positions prepared, and no particular desire to die for an airstrip. As soon as the American landing began, these construction workers and the few troops present did the sensible thing. They abandoned their equipment, their supplies, and their nearly completed airfield, fleeing into the dense jungle that covered most of Guadalcanal's interior. The Marines advanced inland against virtually no organized resistance, moving quickly toward their primary objective. By the following day, American forces had secured the airfield. The Marines found themselves in possession of a nearly operational runway, along with substantial stocks of Japanese construction equipment, food, and supplies. The airfield would soon be renamed Henderson Field, and it would become the focal point of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. But for now, the immediate concern was consolidating the beachhead and beginning the massive task of unloading the supplies needed to sustain the Marine force. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, could look at the first day's results with satisfaction. His forces had achieved complete surprise, secured their primary objectives, and done so with relatively light casualties overall. The operation appeared to be proceeding better than anyone had dared hope given the rushed planning. But Turner and his men didn't know what was coming. Far to the north, at the major Japanese base at Rabaul, urgent reports were arriving about the American invasion. The Japanese reaction would be swift, aggressive, and ultimately devastating for the American fleet. In the early morning hours of August 7th, 1942, the Japanese naval base at Rabaul received an urgent radio transmission from Tulagi. The message was brief but alarming. Enemy flotilla sighted. For the radio operators at Rabaul, this report immediately triggered a cascade of questions. How large was this flotilla? What types of ships? Where exactly were they heading? The answers would come soon enough, and they wouldn't be reassuring. An hour later, a second transmission arrived from Tulagi. This one contained more detail, and the news was worse. The station reported that they were under attack. The enemy was preparing to land. Ships were bombarding their positions, and aircraft were strafing and bombing Japanese installations. The small garrison on Tulagi was about to face an amphibious assault, and they were calling for help. Then, at 8:05 that morning, came the final message from Tulagi. The words transmitted across the airwaves carried both resignation and defiance. Enemy forces overwhelmingly superior will defend our positions to death, pray for eternal victory. After that, the radio station fell silent. No more transmissions came from Tulagi. The men at Rabaul could only assume the worst. Their comrades were fighting for their lives, outnumbered and outgunned, with no hope of reinforcement or escape. The Japanese had been caught off guard by this bold American operation. The combination of poor weather and gaps in reconnaissance had allowed the Allied fleet to approach largely undetected. Heavy clouds and rain squalls had grounded or hampered Japanese patrol aircraft that might otherwise have spotted the American armada days earlier. While some coastal observers and reconnaissance patrols did report contacts, the intelligence didn't coalesce quickly enough to provide adequate warning. The result was operational surprise at the landing beaches. The defenders on Tulagi and Guadalcanal had no time to prepare for what hit them. But if the Americans expected the Japanese to simply accept this fait accompli, they were badly mistaken. The Japanese reaction, though caught off guard, was swift and decisive. Within hours of receiving the first reports, Japanese commanders at Rabaul were already formulating their response. They wouldn't sit passively while the Americans established themselves on Japanese-held territory. The spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy was aggressive, offensive-minded, and utterly unwilling to yield without a fight. The man who would shape that response was Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. At 53 years old, Mikawa commanded the newly created 8th Fleet, a formation assembled to conduct operations in the South Pacific Theater. Mikawa brought considerable experience to this command. He was recognized throughout the Imperial Navy for his good judgment and personal courage. Officers who served under him described Mikawa as a study in contrasts, gentle in manner, with a quiet voice that never rose to a shout, yet also capable of aggressive, even audacious action when the situation demanded it. His reaction to news of the Allied landing would confirm both aspects of his character. When Mikawa heard the reports coming in from Tulagi and Guadalcanal, he didn't convene lengthy planning sessions or wait for detailed intelligence assessments. In his mind, a plan formed immediately. It was simple, direct, and characteristic of both the man and the service he represented. Attack. Mikawa immediately took several actions in rapid succession. First, he dispatched reconnaissance flights to gather more detailed information about the enemy. He needed to know the composition of the American fleet, the number of ships, and most critically, whether aircraft carriers were present. Carriers represented the most dangerous threat to any Japanese surface force, capable of launching devastating airstrikes that could cripple or destroy his ships before they ever got close to the enemy. Second, Mikawa sent urgent orders to all available forces under his command. Every ship that could be made ready was to assemble for an operation against the Allied invasion force. Speed was essential. The longer the Americans remained unmolested, the stronger their position would become. They would unload more supplies, establish stronger defensive positions, and potentially bring in reinforcements. If the Japanese were going to strike, they needed to strike quickly. Third, Mikawa ordered an immediate air raid against the Allied forces in Savo Sound. By fortunate coincidence, Japanese bombers at Rabaul had already been prepared for a strike mission against targets in New Guinea. Mikawa simply redirected this strike force. Instead of attacking New Guinea, they would attack the American transports and warships at Guadalcanal. This air raid would serve multiple purposes. It would harass the invasion force, potentially sink some ships, and most importantly, provide additional intelligence about American dispositions and strength. As reconnaissance reports and raid results came back to Rabaul, Mikawa's understanding of the situation crystallized. This wasn't just a hit-and-run raid by a few destroyers or cruisers. This was something much larger and more serious. The reports indicated that aircraft carriers were involved, providing air cover for the landing operations. Multiple transport ships were present, suggesting a substantial ground force being put ashore. Cruisers and destroyers formed a protective screen around the vulnerable transports. The Americans were conducting a full-scale amphibious invasion, not a mere raid. Given this intelligence about the American formation, Mikawa made a crucial decision about how to conduct his attack. He would strike at night. This decision wasn't made lightly or impulsively. Mikawa had sound tactical and strategic reasons for choosing a night action, reasoning he would later articulate clearly. Mikawa's thinking was straightforward and logical. He had no air support to rely on, and reliable air support was essential for anything other than a night attack. Any daylight operation would leave his ships exposed to devastating American carrier aircraft. On the other hand, Mikawa had absolute confidence in his ships and their crews. He knew that the Japanese Navy's emphasis on night combat training would ensure their chances for success, even without air support. This reasoning reveals much about Mikawa's thinking and about the Japanese Navy's doctrine. He recognized his fundamental weakness. He had no carriers, no air support that could protect his ships during daylight operations. Any daylight approach toward the American fleet would expose his cruisers to devastating air attacks from American carrier aircraft. His ships would be spotted from dozens of miles away, allowing the Americans ample time to prepare their defenses and launch airstrikes. The result would likely be a one-sided slaughter, with Japanese ships being sunk before they could close to gun or torpedo range. But at night, the situation reversed dramatically. Mikawa had absolute confidence in his ships and their crews. This confidence wasn't mere bravado or wishful thinking. It was based on years of intensive training that the Imperial Japanese Navy had devoted to night fighting. Japanese sailors practiced night gunnery, night torpedo attacks, night maneuvering in formation, all the skills needed to fight effectively in darkness. They had superior night optics, including binoculars that were the best in the world at that time. Their Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance, was a weapon of devastating power and range. Most importantly, the Japanese had developed tactics and doctrine specifically for night surface combat. They had trained for exactly this kind of scenario, approaching an enemy force under cover of darkness, achieving surprise, delivering a devastating blow, and withdrawing before dawn could expose them to counterattack. Mikawa knew his men could execute this kind of operation. In fact, they had trained for it repeatedly. Now, they would have the chance to prove that all that training had value in actual combat. Mikawa's plan, once formed, relied heavily on careful approach and maintaining the element of surprise. The operational concept was elegantly simple, which made it more likely to succeed. Complex plans with multiple moving parts and precise timing requirements often fall apart in the chaos of combat. Mikawa's plan avoided this trap through its very simplicity. During daylight hours, Mikawa's force would avoid areas where American reconnaissance aircraft might spot them. The longer his approach remained undetected, the better his chances of achieving surprise. At noon, his flotilla would transit through New Georgia Sound, a body of water that would soon gain a new and ominous nickname among Allied sailors, the Slot. This passage would bring his force within striking range of Guadalcanal, while still maintaining enough distance to avoid immediate detection. As darkness fell, Mikawa would enter Savo Sound itself. His ships would approach the American anchorage under cover of night, using their superior night fighting capabilities to locate and identify enemy vessels. Then would come the attack, quick, violent, and devastating. Japanese guns and torpedoes would strike at the American fleet, targeting the warships protecting the invasion force and, if possible, the vulnerable transport ships themselves. Critically, the plan called for a rapid withdrawal following the attack. Mikawa had no intention of lingering in the area until dawn. Once his ships had delivered their blow, they would retire under cover of darkness. By the time the sun rose and American carrier aircraft could launch, Mikawa's force would be well away from the danger zone, beyond the range of immediate retaliation. With this plan formulated, Mikawa sent a dispatch to Tokyo outlining his proposed operation. He needed approval from the Naval General Staff before committing his forces to such a risky venture. The response from Tokyo initially disappointed him. The staff officers reviewing his plan considered it rash and audacious. They saw too many things that could go wrong, too many risks being taken with valuable warships that Japan could not easily replace. But then the Naval General Staff reconsidered their initial rejection. What other option did they really have? They could send air raids from Rabaul, certainly, but long-range bombing attacks had limitations. The Americans had already demonstrated they could defend their ships against air attack. Simply abandoning Guadalcanal without a fight was unthinkable. Let the Americans land on Japanese-held territory without facing serious opposition. Not a chance. The Japanese spirit was fundamentally a spirit of attack, of aggressive action against the enemy. Passive defense went against every principle that the Imperial Navy had absorbed through decades of training and indoctrination. The Japanese were not going to let the Americans occupy these islands without mounting a serious fight. If Mikawa's night attack represented the best chance to strike back at the invasion force, then that attack should proceed. At 13:30 hours, Tokyo sent their approval. Mikawa's bold operation was authorized. He could proceed with his night attack on the American fleet. Now began the crucial task of assembling the forces for this strike. In mid-afternoon, around 14:30 hours, 2:30 in the afternoon, Mikawa put to sea. His ships sailed from Rabaul to rendezvous with additional forces that would join his striking group. The flotilla he had managed to assemble was not large, but it represented a credible fighting force. The composition of Mikawa's strike force reveals both the strengths and limitations of his position. His flagship was the heavy cruiser Chokai, a formidable warship mounting 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. Chokai would lead the attack, and Mikawa would direct operations from her bridge. Joining Chokai were 4 more heavy cruisers from the 6th Cruiser Division, Aoba, Kako, Kinugasa, and Furitaka. These ships formed the core of Mikawa's striking power. Heavy cruisers were designed for exactly this kind of mission, surface combat against enemy warships. With their 8-inch main batteries and their long-lance torpedoes, these vessels could deliver devastating firepower in a night engagement. 2 light cruisers, Tenryu and Yubari, added additional firepower and scouting capability. While less heavily armed than the heavy cruisers, these ships were faster and more maneuverable, useful for screening and reconnaissance roles. Finally, a single destroyer, Unagi, rounded out the force. One destroyer was hardly adequate for screening such a formation, but it was all that could be made available on such short notice. This was admittedly a small force for attacking what reconnaissance had identified as a substantial American fleet. Mikawa had no battleships, no carriers, limited destroyer support. But this force would have to suffice. Time was critical. Every hour that passed allowed the Americans to strengthen their position. Mikawa would attack with what he had, rather than wait for reinforcements that might arrive too late to matter. Though most of his ships were not the most modern vessels in the Imperial Navy, they still represented an imposing force. The crews were experienced and well-trained. The ships themselves, while not brand new, were well-maintained and combat-ready. Most importantly, both the ships and the men aboard them had trained extensively for exactly the kind of night surface action that Mikawa was planning. As his flotilla formed up and set course for the slot, Mikawa could feel reasonably confident about his chances. He had a sound plan, capable ships, and trained crews. The Americans would be expecting air attacks. That much was certain after the raids that had already been launched. But would they be prepared for a night surface attack by a force of cruisers? That remained to be seen. Everything now depended on maintaining surprise and executing the attack with precision and speed. If Mikawa could achieve both, the Americans were about to receive a very unpleasant shock. If not, his small force could find itself destroyed by American guns and torpedoes before it accomplished anything. The next 24 hours would determine which outcome would prevail. The Japanese reaction to the American landings was immediate and aggressive. Mikawa had ordered airstrikes against the invasion force, and by fortunate coincidence, Japanese bombers at Rabaul had already been prepared for a strike mission. The original plan called for these aircraft to attack ground targets in New Guinea as part of ongoing operations in that theatre. Now, with American ships filling Savo Sound, Mikawa simply redirected the strike force. Instead of bombing New Guinea, they would bomb the American transports and warships at Guadalcanal. Unfortunately for the Japanese, this sudden change of mission created a significant problem. Because the aircraft had been loaded and prepared for the New Guinea mission, they carried bombs rather than torpedoes, the deadly preferred weapon for attacking ships. Torpedoes were far more effective against naval targets, capable of striking below the waterline and opening catastrophic holes in a ship's hull. Bombs, by contrast, had to score direct hits on relatively small targets and often caused less critical damage. Japanese commanders at Rabaul faced a choice. They could delay the attack while ground crews removed the bombs and loaded torpedoes instead. This rearming process would take hours, giving the Americans more time to unload their transports and strengthen their position. Or they could send the aircraft immediately with the weapons they already carried, accepting reduced effectiveness in exchange for speed. Speed won out. Two separate formations would make up the strike force. The main group of bombers would attack first, followed by another formation of 9 Val dive bombers. These Vals faced their own problem. Given the distance to Guadalcanal, they would have insufficient fuel for the attack and the return flight to base. Air crews received orders that they would have to ditch their aircraft in the water near the Shortland Islands after completing their attack and await rescue by Japanese forces in that area. This was a desperate measure, but the situation demanded it. The bombers took off at 9:50 that morning. Dive bombers followed at 10:45. Both formations headed southeast toward Guadalcanal, their crews knowing they were flying into what would certainly be heavily defended airspace. American carriers were providing air cover, and Japanese pilots could expect to face swarms of enemy fighters. Any hope of achieving tactical surprise was thwarted almost immediately. The Allied intelligence network in the Solomon Islands included coast watchers, Australian and native observers stationed on various islands who reported Japanese air and naval movements by radio. These coast watchers spotted the Japanese bomber formations as they flew down the slot. Urgent warnings went out to the Allied Expeditionary Force at Guadalcanal. This gave the Americans precious time to prepare their defenses. Fighter aircraft scrambled from the American carriers. Anti-aircraft gun crews aboard the ships manned their weapons and prepared for action. Transport ships began maneuvering to make themselves harder targets. By the time the Japanese bombers arrived over the target area, the Americans were ready and waiting. At 13:15 hours, 1:15 in the afternoon, the bombers appeared over Savo Sound. 18 American fighters immediately tore into the formation. Despite this opposition, the Japanese bombers pressed their attack, but they faced another serious problem beyond the fighters. Heavy cloud cover forced them to bomb from high altitude. Attempting to descend below the clouds would have exposed them to even more intense fighter attacks and anti-aircraft fire. So they dropped their bombs from high above the clouds, trying to hit ships they could barely see. The results were predictably poor. Bombing accuracy from high altitude was difficult under the best conditions. Bombing through overcast clouds at maneuvering ships made it nearly impossible. Not a single bomb struck an American vessel. The attack achieved precisely nothing. But the price was heavy. American fighters shot down approximately half a dozen Betty bombers. 2 Zero fighters escorting the bombers were also lost. Surviving aircraft turned north and fled back toward Rabaul, having accomplished nothing except to alert the Americans that Japanese air attacks were coming. An hour later, the Naval dive bombers arrived over the target area. These aircraft had better prospects than the high-altitude bombers because they could attack from steep angles, giving them better accuracy. The Vals selected their targets and pushed over into their attack dives. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around them as they plummeted toward the American ships below. One bomb struck a destroyer, causing light damage. That single hit represented the total result of 9 aircraft risking their lives in the attack. Roughly half the Vals were shot down by fighters or anti-aircraft fire. Remaining aircraft left the area and headed for the designated ditching point near the Shortland Islands, where their crews would abandon their aircraft and await rescue. American forces had successfully defended their landing operation against this first Japanese air attack, but the defense had not been without cost. Fighter losses numbered approximately 9 Wildcats, with 1 Dauntless dive bomber also going down. These losses represented experienced pilots and valuable aircraft that couldn't easily be replaced. Still, this Japanese air raid on August 7th proved largely ineffective. No ships had been sunk and barely 1 destroyer damaged. For the loss of roughly 8 aircraft and their crews, the Japanese had accomplished almost nothing. But the Japanese weren't finished. Their second attempt the following day would be even more ambitious and would end in even worse disaster. On August 8th, Rabaul ordered a new strike against the Allied fleet at Guadalcanal. This time, the Japanese were determined to do things properly. 26 Betty bombers would fly the mission with 15 Zero fighters as escort. More importantly, this time the bombers would be properly armed with torpedoes rather than bombs. The Japanese were going to hit the American ships with their most effective anti-ship weapon. This raid would later be reported to Admiral Mikawa as a stunning success. Surviving aircrews would claim they had sunk and damaged 17 ships. Nothing could be further from the truth. The attack would prove to be an absolute catastrophe for the Japanese, resulting in losses so severe they would shock even the high command at Naval. 41 aircraft took off at 8 o'clock that morning. Bombers carrying torpedoes flew in formation with their Zero escorts above and around them. The original plan called for these aircraft to find and attack the American carriers that reconnaissance had reported operating near Guadalcanal. Sinking or damaging American carriers would be a tremendous strategic victory, potentially crippling American air support for the invasion. But this effort proved unsuccessful. Bombers searched for the carriers without finding them. Unknown to the Japanese pilots, Admiral Fletcher had already begun withdrawing his carriers from the immediate area, concerned about the risk of Japanese air attacks and his dwindling fuel supplies. The carriers were moving away from Guadalcanal, putting themselves beyond the search area where the Japanese bombers were looking. Unable to locate the carriers, the strike force received orders to redirect their attack. They would hit the transport ships instead. While not as valuable a target as carriers, the transports were critical to the American invasion. Sink enough transports, and the Marines ashore would be stranded without adequate supplies or reinforcements. Bombers altered course and headed for Savo Sound. The Japanese formation unexpectedly appeared over Florida Island, descending lower as they prepared to begin their torpedo attack runs. The timing was unfortunate for the Americans. Only 3 fighters were providing air cover at that particular moment. Most of the combat air patrol was elsewhere, either returning to their carriers to refuel or patrolling other sectors. These 3 fighters were not in position to effectively intercept such a large formation of bombers. At 11:55, the situation looked extremely bad. 23 torpedo bombers now had an essentially clear path to attack all the ships anchored in the Sound. With so few fighters to oppose them, and the bombers carrying torpedoes instead of bombs, it seemed nothing could prevent the Japanese from achieving absolute havoc among the crowded transports and their escorts. Except there was something that could stop them: a very large amount of anti-aircraft fire. The Mitsubishi Type 1 attack bomber, known to the Allies as the Betty, was the Imperial Navy's main land-based bomber. It had many excellent qualities. Fast for a bomber, it could outrun some fighters. Its exceptional range enabled missions that would be impossible for most other aircraft of its size. These characteristics made it valuable for operations across the vast distances of the Pacific. But the Betty had one fatal flaw. To achieve its speed and range, Japanese designers had made the aircraft lightly constructed with minimal armor protection. Fuel tanks were not self-sealing. When hit by bullets or shell fragments, they would leak fuel that could easily ignite. The Betty would gain an infamous reputation among its own crews and among Allied pilots alike. It was unable to withstand even small amounts of damage before being engulfed in flames. Allied pilots would give it a sardonic nickname, the Type 1 lighter. Now everyone was about to see why. Photographs taken during this attack capture the moment bombers descended to sea level to begin their torpedo runs. You can see the skill of the Japanese pilots and how low above the water they flew. Just a few feet separated the aircraft from the wave tops. Flying at this altitude required exceptional piloting ability and nerves of steel. One slight error, one moment of inattention, and a bomber would hit the water and cartwheel to destruction. But at this small altitude, every anti-aircraft weapon aboard the American ships became effective. Heavy guns, light guns, machine guns, all could engage targets flying so low and so close. and effective they were. American ships unleashed an impressive barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Tracers filled the air like a deadly spider web. Shells burst around the Japanese bombers. Bomber after bomber was hit and crashed into the sea. Some exploded in mid-air as their fuel tanks ignited. Others cartwheeled across the water, breaking apart as they tumbled. Still others simply nosed over and dove straight into the ocean, their pilots killed at the controls. One Betty, already heavily damaged and trailing smoke and flame, lost control. The stricken aircraft crashed into the transport ship George F. Elliot. The impact ignited a fire so intense that it couldn't be controlled. Flames spread throughout the ship, despite the best efforts of damage control parties. Later that evening, George F. Elliot would have to be abandoned and sunk. Only one Japanese torpedo bomber managed to hit its target successfully. That unfortunate target was the destroyer Jarvis, which had already been fighting hard during the initial landing operations. The torpedo struck Jarvis and caused heavy damage. Her bow began to settle as water flooded into the damaged compartments. But remarkably, Jarvis remained afloat, her crew working desperately to keep her from sinking. Photographs captured both casualties of this raid in a single haunting image. Jarvis is visible in the center of the frame, without power and with her bow noticeably submerged. In the background, George F. Elliot can be seen burning fiercely. Both ships would eventually be lost. Elliot to the uncontrollable fires, Jarvis to a subsequent Japanese airstrike 2 days later. After 10 minutes of intense action, the attack was over. The few Betty bombers that survived the gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire turned away and fled the area. Their crews were undoubtedly shaken by what they had just experienced. Flying through that wall of fire had been a nightmare, and many of their comrades hadn't made it through. Then, the terrible scope of the Japanese losses became apparent. Besides the 2 Zero fighters that had been shot down, approximately 18 of the 23 torpedo bombers had also been lost. Most of them fell victim to the intense anti-aircraft fire rather than to the handful of American fighters that had engaged them. This single raid became the largest loss of bomber crews during the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Roughly 125 experienced airmen were killed. Pilots, bombardiers, navigators, gunners, all gone in a matter of minutes. And what had the Japanese accomplished with these terrible losses? They had sunk 1 transport ship and heavily damaged 1 destroyer. That was all. 2 ships hit in exchange for roughly 20 aircraft and over 100 irreplaceable trained airmen. By any measure, this was a catastrophic failure. Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious forces, could look at the results of these first 2 days with considerable satisfaction. In all respects, Operation Watchtower had gotten off to a successful start. The Allies could be proud of what they had accomplished. They had withstood 3 separate Japanese air attacks with minimal losses to their fleet. They had achieved their main objectives, seizing Tulagi and its seaplane base, capturing the airfield on Guadalcanal. Marines were ashore and establishing defensive perimeters around their positions. The only real problem facing Turner was that unloading supplies from the transports was taking longer than planned. The process was complicated, time-consuming, and made more difficult by the constant threat of air attacks. Ships had to maneuver to avoid bombs and torpedoes, interrupting the unloading process. Marines ashore needed vast quantities of ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, construction equipment, and countless other items. Getting all of this material off the ships and onto the beaches was proving to be a massive undertaking. Still, according to Admiral Turner's assessment, the operation was beginning well. Japanese forces had thrown everything they could at the invasion force and had been repulsed. American casualties had been relatively light. The beachheads were secure. There was reason for cautious optimism. But after 2 days of continuous fighting, most of the sailors under Turner's command were undoubtedly exhausted. They had been at battle stations for hours on end, enduring the stress of air attacks and the physical demands of unloading operations. Gun crews were tired from manning their weapons through multiple alerts. Damage control parties were exhausted from fighting fires and repairing damage. Officers and men alike had gotten little sleep since the operation began. Many of these sailors were hoping that this night, the night of August 8th going into August 9th, would be quiet. They hoped they could finally stand down from battle stations and get some much-needed rest. They had faced Japanese air attacks for 2 days straight. Surely they deserved one peaceful night to recover their strength. They would not get their wish. Even as exhausted American sailors prepared for what they hoped would be a quiet night, Admiral Mikawa's flotilla was racing down the slot toward them. The Japanese were coming, not from the air this time, but across the surface of the sea. And when they arrived, they would deliver a blow that would dwarf anything the air raids had accomplished. The following day, August 8th, brought a moment of concern for Admiral Mikawa. Around mid-morning, his lookout spotted an Allied aircraft circling above his flotilla. The plane was clearly observing them, noting their composition, course, and speed. Reports indicate that Japanese radio operators detected Allied reconnaissance transmissions, though the exact intercepts remain unclear in historical records. What was certain, Mikawa now knew his force had been spotted. About 40 minutes later, lookouts spotted another aircraft following them. This second sighting confirmed what Mikawa already suspected. The moment of surprise was lost. This was a serious blow to Mikawa's plan. His entire operational concept had been based on achieving surprise. The plan called for approaching undetected, striking suddenly in the darkness, and withdrawing before the Americans could organize an effective response. Now, the Americans knew he was coming. They knew roughly where he was and what direction he was heading. More immediately, Mikawa now faced the very real possibility that the Americans would respond with an air raid. Those reconnaissance aircraft would report back to their carriers. Whichever American admiral commanded the carrier force could launch a massive airstrike against Mikawa's cruisers. Without air cover of his own, Mikawa's ships would be devastatingly vulnerable to such an attack. His force could be crippled or destroyed before ever getting close to the American anchorage. To reduce the chance of such an airstrike catching his force in daylight, Mikawa made a crucial decision. He would delay his progress until later in the day, waiting until evening to resume his approach. The cover of darkness would provide some protection against air attack. American carrier aircraft would have great difficulty finding and attacking his ships once the sun set. This delay would put him behind schedule, but it might save his entire force from destruction. Even so, Mikawa had reasons for optimism, despite losing the element of surprise. His own reconnaissance flight that day had revealed crucial intelligence about the American disposition. Though his force was significantly outnumbered by Allied ships, the Americans were operating in 2 separate groups. This was excellent news from a tactical perspective. A fundamental principle of naval warfare held that concentration of force was crucial. By dividing their strength, the Americans had created an opportunity for a skilled opponent to exploit. Mikawa could potentially defeat each group individually rather than having to face the entire American force at once. If he could position his ships correctly, he might be able to destroy one American group before the other could come to its aid. Then, he could turn on the second group and deal with it separately. Keeping in mind his disadvantaged position and the lost element of surprise, Mikawa decided to continue the mission. The risks were significant, but so were the potential rewards. If he could destroy or cripple the American warships protecting the invasion force, those vulnerable transports would be exposed to further attacks. The entire American operation might be thrown into chaos. It was worth the risk. In the late afternoon, Mikawa began his progress through New Georgia Sound. This body of water would soon gain a new and ominous nickname among Allied sailors who would come to know it all too well. They would call it the Slot, and it would become the scene of numerous savage naval battles over the coming months. But for now, it was simply the water passage that Mikawa had to transit to reach his objective. Tension aboard Mikawa's ships ran high. Every man knew they had been spotted. Every man knew that American carrier aircraft could appear at any moment. Gun crews scanned the sky constantly, watching for the first sign of incoming aircraft. Lookouts maintained vigilant watch in all directions. Officers checked and rechecked their damage control preparations, knowing that a single bomb or torpedo hit could cripple a cruiser. The waiting was almost worse than combat itself. Despite this potential danger hanging over his force, Mikawa had to focus on other matters. His pre-battle plan needed to be finalized and communicated to his ships. There was no time to waste on elaborate planning sessions or complex tactical discussions. The plan had to be simple, clear, and executable, even in the chaos and confusion of night combat. Mikawa faced a significant challenge in formulating his battle plan. His forces, with the exception of the 6th Cruiser Division, had never worked together before. The ships had not conducted joint training exercises. The captains had not practiced coordinating their movements and attacks. In many navies, this lack of prior coordination would be considered a severe handicap. Complex tactical maneuvers require practice and familiarity between ships. Mikawa decided to keep things simple. Simplicity would be his watchword. No complicated battle formations that required precise timing and positioning. No elaborate sequences of maneuvers that could fall apart if one ship made a mistake. Just a simple battle line would suffice. His ships would form a column, one behind the other, and steam into the American anchorage together. Each ship would engage targets as they appeared. This simple approach had significant advantages. It was easy to understand and execute. It required minimal radio communication between ships, which was important because radio transmissions could be intercepted and might alert the Americans to his approach. It kept his force concentrated, allowing the ships to support each other, and it played to the strengths of Japanese night fighting doctrine and training. In the late afternoon, Mikawa communicated his pre-battle plan to his men. The message was characteristically direct and clear. "We'll penetrate south of Savo Island and torpedo main enemy forces at Guadalcanal. Then move toward Tulagi and strike with torpedoes and gunfire, after which withdraw north of Savo Island." This plan outlined the essential elements of the operation in a few sentences. First, they would approach from the northwest, passing south of Savo Island to enter the Sound. Second, they would attack the American forces near Guadalcanal with torpedoes, the long-lance weapons that were the pride of the Japanese Navy. Third, after dealing with those forces, they would swing north toward Tulagi and engage any ships they found there with both torpedoes and gunfire. Finally, they would withdraw to the north of Savo Island and retire up the slot before dawn could expose them to air attack. Shortly after communicating this battle plan, Mikawa issued another important order. All men were to discard flammable materials from their ships. This might seem like a minor detail, but in naval combat, fire was one of the deadliest threats a ship could face. Wooden furniture, paint, canvas, oil-soaked rags, and countless other flammable items accumulated aboard ships during normal operations. In combat, shell hits or bomb explosions could ignite these materials, starting fires that could rage out of control. Better to throw such items overboard now than to have them become fuel for catastrophic fires later. The sun set in the early evening. As darkness fell across the Solomon Islands, tension aboard Mikawa's ships began to subside. It was becoming increasingly clear that no air attack was coming. The Americans had apparently not exploited their morning observation of his force. No swarms of dive bombers had appeared overhead. No torpedo planes had made low-level attack runs against his cruisers. His force remained intact and undamaged. That evening brought additional intelligence that both encouraged and puzzled Mikawa. Evidence suggested American carriers were transmitting in the area. This confirmed what reconnaissance had already indicated. Carriers were indeed somewhere nearby. But the situation raised more questions than it answered. Where exactly were these carriers? How many were there? Most puzzling of all, why hadn't they attacked? The Americans had spotted his force more than 7 hours earlier. They had had ample time to launch airstrikes against him. Carrier aircraft could have found his ships and attacked them during the afternoon. Yet no attack had materialized. No further reconnaissance aircraft had been seen after the morning sightings. This was strange, even suspicious. Was it a trap? Were the Americans deliberately holding back, waiting for him to commit himself before springing an ambush? Or had they simply failed to take advantage of the opportunity their reconnaissance had provided? And Mikawa had no way of knowing. He could only proceed with his mission and deal with whatever he encountered. Later that evening, Mikawa received encouraging news from the air group that had attacked the Allied formation earlier that day. Like many combat pilots throughout the war, the air crews filed optimistic after-action reports claiming substantial damage to enemy ships. Such overclaiming was common in the heat of battle. Pilots genuinely believed they had scored hits that might have been near misses or mistook damage for sinking. Multiple pilots might claim the same ship as their victim. While the actual results were almost certainly less dramatic than reported, any success against the American fleet would help Mikawa's chances. Regardless of the airstrike's actual effectiveness, the situation was looking increasingly favorable. His own force remained undamaged. The Americans had failed to attack him despite knowing his location, and his ships were approaching their objective under cover of darkness. Things were going as well as could be expected. Late that night, around 11:30, Mikawa launched 3 float planes ahead of his flotilla. This was a unique tactic that the Allies had never encountered before. These aircraft would not attack or spot for gunfire. Instead, they had a specific and crucial mission. Just before the battle began, they would drop flares over the American ships. These flares would illuminate the enemy forces, turning night into an eerie twilight. The Americans would be brightly lit, while Mikawa's ships remained in darkness. This would provide Mikawa with an enormous tactical advantage. His gunners would be able to see their targets clearly, while the Americans would be firing at ships they could barely make out against the dark background. His torpedo crews would be able to aim their weapons with precision. It was a simple but brilliant tactical innovation. With midnight approaching, the mood aboard Mikawa's ships was undoubtedly high. These men had trained for years, specifically for night battles. They had practiced again and again, learning how to fight in darkness, how to use their superior night optics, how to coordinate attacks without radio communication that might give away their position. Now they would have the chance to prove themselves in actual combat. Now they would show what all that training had been worth. Earlier that evening, Mikawa had signalled his ships with a message that was reminiscent of Admiral Nelson's famous speech before the great British victory at Trafalgar. Nelson had signalled his fleet that England expects that every man will do his duty. Now, more than a century later, Mikawa sent his own inspiring message to his men. In best tradition of Imperial Navy, will meet enemy in night battle. Every man expected to do his best. It was a simple message, but it carried profound meaning for the Japanese sailors who received it. They understood what was being asked of them. They knew the risks they were about to face. They knew that American guns and torpedoes could send their ships to the bottom just as easily as Japanese weapons could sink American vessels. But they also knew they were ready. They were trained, they were prepared, and they were determined to uphold the honor and fighting spirit of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Mikawa's men would not disappoint him. In the coming hours, they would demonstrate exactly what Japanese training and Japanese fighting spirit could achieve in a night battle. They would show the Americans that despite losing the element of complete surprise, despite being outnumbered by the combined Allied fleet, Japanese sailors could still deliver a devastating blow. The stage was set. Mikawa's force was approaching the entrance to Savo Sound. His ships were ready for battle. His men were at their stations. In a few hours, the Battle of Savo Island would begin, and it would become one of the most devastating defeats in United States naval history. Two elements stand as the most important in any combat operation: intelligence and communication. In both cases, the Allies would fall catastrophically short. The aerial reconnaissance and communication network the Allies had established was weak, riddled with gaps, and prone to failure. This weakness enabled the complete failure to detect Mikawa's approach in time to respond effectively. What followed resembled a domino effect. One failure led to another, then another, each compounding the problems created by the previous mistake. The failures accumulated, putting the Allies in the worst possible state before Mikawa's arrival. To understand how this catastrophe unfolded, we need to begin by examining exactly what information Admiral Turner had on the eve of battle. By the evening of August 8th, Admiral Turner possessed limited intelligence about Japanese movements. He knew that 3 main enemy sightings had occurred over the previous 2 days. Each of these sightings would prove important, though not all in ways that helped the Allied cause. The first sighting had occurred the day before, on August 7th. Submarine S-38 had spotted Mikawa's ships sailing southeast. This report, while accurate, proved essentially useless for Turner's immediate purposes. It had occurred a full day earlier and didn't indicate whether the ships were heading toward Guadalcanal. For all Turner knew, these ships could be sailing to Kavieng or Buka or any number of other Japanese bases in the region. The report was simply too old and too ambiguous to act upon. The second report would prove decisive and would influence Turner most profoundly. This observation of Mikawa's forces occurred on August 8th, around 11 in the morning. Unfortunately, this report came with two serious problems that would prove fatal to Allied preparations. First, the flight crew's ship identification abilities were poor. They erroneously reported two seaplane carriers sailing in the formation. This misidentification would lead Turner to draw entirely wrong conclusions about Japanese intentions. Seaplane carriers suggested one thing: base-building operations. Heavy cruisers suggested something entirely different: combat operations. The flight crew's error in identifying ship types would prove catastrophic. But the much more substantial problem was timing. When the report finally arrived that evening to Turner aboard his flagship, it was approximately 10 to 11 hours old. 10 hours in modern naval warfare might as well be 10 days. Ships could travel hundreds of miles in that time. Situations could change completely. Intelligence that might have been actionable at mid-morning was nearly worthless by late evening. What explains this terrible delay? This question is worth exploring in considerable detail. Many historians believe this communication failure represents the primary reason for the great debacle the Allies would face at Savo Island. The inability to detect Mikawa sailing through the slot in time to respond stemmed directly from this breakdown in communications. To Turner's defense, he had good reasons for believing his forces would get adequate warning if Japanese units attempted to attack his positions. He had dozens of aircraft conducting reconnaissance across a wide area. On paper, this reconnaissance network should have provided ample warning of any approaching Japanese force. But an error in operation management remained hidden from him, an error that would prove disastrous. The problem lay in the fact that two different commands were conducting reconnaissance in the area. Turner operated under South Pacific Command under Vice Admiral Gormley. However, the aircraft conducting reconnaissance in the Rabaul sector and Northern Solomons belonged to Southwest Pacific Command, which was General Douglas MacArthur's responsibility. This divided command structure created seams in the coverage, gaps where critical information could fall through. An arrangement had been concluded between the two commanders to address this problem. If an aircraft made an observation, it would deliver the report to its base. If that report was deemed urgent and related to Operation Watchtower, it would be delivered directly to Admiral Turner. This arrangement seemed reasonable on paper. But note the critical flaw: Turner had no direct connection with these aircraft. Essentially, Turner's security in the northern sector was completely dependent on MacArthur's command, on MacArthur's pilots, and on their ability to deliver reports on time. Turner was relying on people outside his chain of command, people he couldn't directly supervise or communicate with. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. Things didn't proceed according to plan because a slight but critical oversight occurred. Due to the necessary secrecy regarding Operation Watchtower, very few personnel were familiar with this inter-command arrangement. This included the base crew and the aircraft conducting reconnaissance. In other words, leadership had forgotten to tell the people who actually mattered. Nobody had told the reconnaissance bases, if you find something suspicious, say a flotilla of ships heading southeast that could threaten the Allied landing, let Admiral Turner know immediately. As a consequence, for the pilots conducting reconnaissance, this was just another routine patrol. They weren't looking for potential threats that could endanger an invasion landing. They couldn't look for such threats because they didn't even know about the ongoing landing operation. Security had been maintained so well that the very people who needed to know about Watchtower to protect it were kept in the dark. As can be expected, consequences would certainly follow. Now let's trace the journey of the mid-morning sighting report, because this journey explains much about why the Allies were caught unprepared. Around 11 in the morning, an Australian reconnaissance aircraft spotted Mikawa's flotilla. The observation was sent to base by radio. No confirmation was received. To the pilot's credit, he immediately returned to base to deliver the report personally, recognizing its potential importance. Shortly after noon, the aircraft landed and the report was delivered to the duty officer. This officer, unfamiliar with Operation Watchtower, judged the report as non-urgent. He followed standard procedure for routing messages through channels. Historians have reconstructed the likely path of this message through multiple relay points. The report appears to have been routed through Port Moresby, then to Townsville. At Townsville, the message sat for several hours while nobody recognized its urgency. Eventually, the message continued its journey to Brisbane, then to a naval radio station in Canberra. From Canberra, it was forwarded to Pearl Harbor. And from Pearl Harbor, it was finally forwarded to the American ships at Guadalcanal. The message that should have been delivered in minutes took approximately 10 to 11 hours to reach its destination. By the time Turner received it around 9:35 that evening, Mikawa was already approaching Savo Sound under cover of darkness. A third observation occurred not long after the mid-morning report. This sighting could have corrected the errors that delayed the first report. Except it suffered from exactly the same procedural problems. The report was deemed unimportant by people who didn't know about Watchtower. It was sent the long route to Turner through multiple relay points. Turner received this report well into the evening, many hours after the observation was made. What we've just witnessed represents a catastrophic communication failure. Critical information was delayed at the very moment when time mattered most. This failure cannot be understated in its importance. Most historians judge that had Turner received a timely report, he would likely have sent additional reconnaissance flights to track Mikawa's movements. These flights would probably have found Mikawa's force transiting the slot. After locating Mikawa, Turner could have ordered the airstrike that the Japanese expected and feared. Moreover, all ships in Savo Sound would probably have been at full battle stations with guns manned and ready. How unfortunate for the Allies that none of this happened. With the communication factor proving unreliable, Turner was left with very little useful intelligence information from reconnaissance. As would become apparent, poor pilot skills in ship identification provided him with a false view of the situation. This false view led him to lower his guard over the operation at precisely the wrong moment. Admiral Turner had to make an assessment that evening based on the information available to him. He made this assessment based primarily on the mid-morning report. Unfortunately, the mistaken identification of Japanese forces would play a fatal role in his thinking. The report stated that 2 seaplane carriers were sailing in the group. If this identification was correct, Turner judged that the Japanese were possibly building another seaplane base. Of course, the report also mentioned an escort of cruisers and destroyers sailing along, but Turner reasoned that this group would never dare conduct a night attack against his much larger force. This assumption would prove disastrously wrong. Here, Turner made his critical error. He based his judgment on an assumption of what the Japanese might do rather than what they were capable of doing. In other words, Turner's assessment was based on an estimate of what the enemy might do, not what the enemy was capable of accomplishing. He concluded that the enemy was most likely just building a seaplane base and wouldn't attack. Events would prove this conclusion catastrophically wrong. To be fair to Turner, he didn't make this decision simply based on a hunch that the enemy wouldn't attack. He was equally concerned about the northwestern approach to Savo Sound, specifically the slot. So concerned was he that he ordered an afternoon search to cover this area. If Mikawa continued southeast through the slot, Turner's reconnaissance aircraft would surely spot him. This seemed like prudent planning. But again, another communication failure occurred. Turner sent the order for the afternoon search. His seaplane tender never received the order. Exactly why this order failed to reach its destination remains unclear. Perhaps radio problems, perhaps administrative error. Regardless of the reason, no afternoon reconnaissance was conducted, though Turner assumed it had been. Because he received no reports from this search that never happened, he took this silence as evidence that the flotilla hadn't continued through the slot. Not until around midnight would Turner learn that the search had never flown that afternoon. By then, it was far too late. Turner must have wondered, did that flotilla continue south through the slot? Turner didn't know, and now he had no way to find out before morning. We must mention here that American overconfidence was also at play in this disaster. The Allies felt a sense of superiority over their opponent. Even contemplating the worst-case scenario of being attacked, they were confident they could defend themselves. Turner himself would later state he was satisfied with the arrangements and hoped the enemy would attack, believing they would receive a warm reception. Two things need to be said about this assessment. First, Turner was apparently unaware of the Japanese Navy's expertise in night fighting. Had he known about the years of training Japanese sailors had devoted to night combat, he would likely have been far more cautious in his assessment. Second, with the poor disposition of his forces that we're about to examine, this confidence was misplaced. The Americans were setting themselves up for a catastrophic defeat, and they didn't even realize it. Turner's two transport groups were protected by his cruiser group, under the command of British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley. Crutchley's force was responsible for guarding the western entrances to the Sound. Under his command was a group of 6 American and Australian cruisers, with 4 destroyers as escort. On paper, this Allied flotilla appeared more than capable of dealing with whatever the Japanese might throw at it. However, because Crutchley's force was protecting both entrances to Savo Sound, the forces had been divided into 2 groups. This division would prove disastrous. It allowed Mikawa to engage each group individually rather than having to face the concentrated strength of the entire Allied force. The principle of concentration of force, one of the most fundamental concepts in military strategy, had been violated. The Allies would pay a terrible price for this mistake. The Southern Group operated under Admiral Crutchley's direct command. It consisted of 2 Australian ships, the flagship Australia and her sister ship Canberra. The American cruiser Chicago sailed with them. 2 destroyers provided escort, Patterson and Bagley. This group patrolled south of Savo Island, guarding the southern approach to the anchorage. The Northern Group operated under the command of Captain Reefcoll. It consisted of 3 cruisers, the flagship Vincennes, along with Quincy and Astoria. 2 destroyers accompanied them, Wilson and Helm. This group patrolled north of Savo Island, guarding the northern approach. There was also an eastern group under Rear Admiral Scott. This force included 2 light cruisers and 2 destroyers. However, as events would unfold, this group would play no role in the coming fight. They were positioned too far away to intervene in time. The forward protection of the entire task force was inadequate, and this inadequacy stemmed from a simple shortage of resources. There weren't enough destroyers available. Many destroyers were needed to protect the transport ships from possible submarine attack, a very real threat in these waters. Consequently, only 2 destroyers could be deployed to watch the northwestern entrances to the Sound, Blue, and Ralph Talbot. 2 destroyers to guard the approaches to an entire invasion fleet. It wasn't nearly enough. Historical accounts note that Crutchley chose these 2 ships for picket duty because the 4th Torpedo Squadron commander indicated that, of 9 ships in the squadron, Blue and Ralph Talbot consistently achieved the best results with their search radar. This selection highlights an important aspect of Allied thinking: heavy reliance on radar technology. The Allies were placing considerable faith in radar to detect the enemy from a distance if attacked. Radar represented cutting-edge technology, and it had shown promise in various applications. But at this point in the war, Americans were still gaining experience with this relatively new technology. The equipment was temperamental, the operators were learning on the job, and the interpretation of radar returns was more art than science. Despite Blue and Ralph Talbot's reputation for good radar performance, they would fail to detect Mikawa's approaching force that night. Neither Blue nor Ralph Talbot would detect Mikawa as he approached. To make matters worse, there was an enormous 8-mile gap between their picket stations. At the farthest point from each other, the 2 destroyers could be up to 20 miles apart. By chance, Mikawa would slip through precisely this gap, completely undetected. The picket line that was supposed to provide early warning would fail utterly in its mission. Another factor needs discussion: the physical condition of the sailors manning these ships. The cruisers had been at battle stations for approximately 15 hours. Men had been at their posts through multiple air raid alerts, through the stress of combat operations, through the physical demands of their duties. Everyone was exhausted. This night, these exhausted crews would finally get to rest, with ships set to Condition 2 readiness. Condition 2 meant that battle stations and guns were only partially manned. About half the crew could rest, while the other half maintained watch. This was standard procedure to allow crews to recover their strength. But it meant that when the Japanese attacked, many gun positions would be unmanned. Many sailors would be in their bunks rather than at their stations. Fatigue and reduced manning would prove to be yet another factor explaining why Blue never detected Mikawa's flotilla, even though the Japanese ships passed within approximately 2 miles of her position. To all these problems was added one final crucial mistake. Admiral Crutchley was summoned to a conference that night with Admiral Turner. Around 9 in the evening, the flagship Australia departed from her formation position. Before sailing, Admiral Crutchley signalled Captain Bode of Chicago, "Take charge of patrol, will or will not rejoin you later." Unfortunately, Crutchley didn't signal this same message to Captain Reefcoll, who was technically now the senior officer present with the screening force. Captain Bode received the message and attempted to move ahead of Canberra to lead the formation from the front. During this manoeuvre, he changed his mind. Manoeuvring at night was always complicated and potentially dangerous. Better to wait a few hours until the Admiral returned rather than risk a collision or confusion in the darkness. Bode decided to maintain his current position. As events would unfold, Admiral Crutchley wouldn't return that night. He would miss the entire battle, occupied at the conference with Turner. The discussion at that conference would concern Admiral Fletcher's decision to withdraw his carriers from the area. While Crutchley and Turner discussed this withdrawal, Mikawa's ships were racing toward them through the darkness. Thus was achieved a confused and dysfunctional command structure. The main commander was absent from his post. Captain Bode was now commanding, but from the rear of his formation rather than the front. Captain Reefcoll was now the senior officer present, but he didn't know it. He also didn't know that the commanding admiral was gone. Nobody had told him about any of these changes. The preparation for catastrophe was now complete. Intelligence had failed to provide timely warning. Communication systems had broken down at multiple points. The force disposition was flawed, with units separated rather than concentrated. The picket line was inadequate and had gaps. Radar, despite expectations, would prove ineffective. Crews were exhausted and at reduced manning. The command structure was confused, and Turner had made a flawed assessment that led him to believe no attack was imminent. Everything that could go wrong had gone wrong. The Allies had created the perfect conditions for a devastating surprise attack. And Mikawa's force was now entering Savo Sound, ready to exploit every single one of these failures. The Allies had failed to detect Mikawa's forces sailing through the slot. Turner had made an erroneous conclusion based on faulty intelligence information, leaving his ships unprepared. His forces had weak picket protection, with enormous gaps. Cruiser strength was divided into two groups that could be defeated individually. Battle stations were only partially manned, with exhausted crews. The overall commander was absent at a conference. And what did Mikawa have against all these Allied weaknesses? The undisputed advantage number one in night battle, the element of surprise. With these circumstances, tragic consequences for the Allies would inevitably follow. The Japanese were notably well equipped with excellent night optics. Their large naval binoculars and highly trained lookouts gave them a real advantage in darkness. 43 minutes after midnight, lookouts spotted an enemy destroyer at a remarkable distance. In the darkness, this kind of detection range was testament to both the quality of Japanese optical equipment and the training of their lookouts. Mikawa immediately reduced speed and changed course to slip past the destroyer. The Japanese column brought heavy firepower to bear, with numerous guns trained on this small warship. Gunners stood ready to open fire if it sounded the alarm. But nothing happened. The lone destroyer seemed not to notice their presence, continuing on its patrol course and moving farther and farther away. Mikawa could scarcely believe his good fortune. His force had miraculously managed to slip past undetected. First, no American air raids had caught him despite being spotted that morning. Now he could slip past this weak picket without raising an alarm. Had he truly achieved surprise? Or was this perhaps a clever trap with Americans waiting to ambush him deeper in the Sound? Regardless of what was coming, Mikawa knew his men were well trained and equipped to handle everything in their path. He increased speed to approximately 26 knots. At 1:33 in the morning, he issued the order his crews had been waiting for. All ships into battle. Mikawa couldn't know it then, but he had in reality achieved complete surprise. The Japanese had entered the Sound. As they passed Savo Island, a solitary ship unexpectedly appeared on their port side. It was the heavily damaged destroyer Jarvis, the same vessel that had been torpedoed in the previous day's air raid. Now she was leaving the area, limping toward Australia for repairs. By pure chance, Jarvis found herself on a nearly collision course with Mikawa's force. But again, Mikawa waited and didn't open fire on the destroyer. To everyone's surprise, Jarvis continued on without taking any action. The only explanation could be inattentiveness and fatigue. Even though the crippled destroyer approached incredibly close to the Japanese line, she didn't open fire and probably didn't even spot them. Jarvis represented the last hope the Allies had to sound the alarm before the attack began. That hope passed by in the darkness, unseeing and unseen. The destroyer Unagi separated from the formation to deal with this ship if necessary. At 1:36, lookouts spotted Canberra and Chicago heading directly toward the Japanese formation. Now, nothing stood between Mikawa and the southern group. The moment they had waited for so long had finally arrived. At this moment, Allied sailors could hear the sounds of aircraft flying above them in the darkness. Most assumed these were friendly aircraft, perhaps American patrol planes from the carriers. Only a few correctly guessed these were Japanese. But even then, no alarm was sounded. The fatal seconds ticked away. At 1:43, the destroyer Patterson spotted the Japanese ships and sent what would become an infamous message. Warning, warning, unknown ships entering harbour. But the warning came too late. 4 torpedoes from Chokai were already in the water, racing toward their targets. A moment later, flares from the Japanese float planes dropped over the Allied ships, illuminating them in harsh, flickering light. The battle was initiated. Chokai opened fire, her guns roaring in the night. The rest of the Japanese formation followed immediately. Fire was concentrated on the first ship they saw clearly, Canberra. From close range, a shower of shells began falling on the unlucky Australian cruiser. Canberra heroically turned to starboard, attempting to place herself between the enemy and the transport ships she was sworn to protect. Her crew tried desperately to return fire, but they never got the chance. The Australian cruiser was struck by approximately 24 artillery shells in rapid succession. All the damage was inflicted exclusively on the port side, the side facing the Japanese. The engine room took a direct hit, and Canberra lost all power. Her captain was mortally wounded on the bridge. Several hits struck below the waterline, opening the ship's hull to the sea. Soon the ship began to list. Canberra was left motionless in the water, engulfed in fire, her crew fighting desperately to save their ship. Chicago, the American cruiser sailing near Canberra, saw torpedoes heading toward her and attempted to dodge. Captain Bode ordered evasive maneuvers, but one torpedo fired by Kako struck the starboard side. Fortunately for Chicago, the damage was less catastrophic than it might have been. The torpedo struck the bow, essentially cutting it off, but didn't penetrate the main hull. A moment later, the superstructure was hit by a 6-inch shell. Confusion reigned on Chicago's bridge. What was actually happening? Where were the Japanese? The crew's response was slow, hampered by the chaos and the unexpected nature of the attack. Chicago's main guns never got the chance to fire at the Japanese cruisers. Her secondary guns managed to score a hit on the light cruiser Tenryu, causing casualties among the Japanese crew. But then Chicago turned away and left the area westward, no longer engaging in the fight. Captain Bode would later state that he was led away by firing he saw to the west. He probably witnessed the firefight between the destroyer Unagi and the crippled Jarvis. The damaged American destroyer performed remarkably well against Unagi despite her injuries. After approximately 5 minutes of exchanging fire, the Japanese destroyer sailed away. However, this engagement was just a skirmish. The main duel was yet to occur, and it would take place east of Chicago's position. Captain Bode's actions that night would later come under severe criticism. His cruiser, with its main guns still undamaged, left the battle area, thus abandoning the transport ships he was supposed to protect. Perhaps more significantly, he didn't send any message or warning to the Northern Group ships about what was happening. By withdrawing, he allowed the Southern Group to be defeated in approximately 6 minutes without providing any support. These decisions would haunt him for the rest of his life. The destroyers escorting the Southern Group were mostly ignored by the Japanese. Bagley conducted an ineffective torpedo attack that hit nothing, then left the fight heading westward. Patterson heroically attacked the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubari, steaming directly toward them and opening fire. She hit nothing but took a hit in her rear turret from return fire. Damaged but still operational, Patterson withdrew from the immediate area. The Southern Group had been shattered in minutes. Now Mikawa turned his attention to the Northern Group. At this point, Mikawa noticed the Northern Group and ordered his ships to sail toward it. Captain Reefcoal in the Northern Group heard the gunfire erupting to the south. He knew some kind of fight was occurring in the Southern Group's area, but he faced a difficult decision. Should he leave his station to assist, potentially leaving his assigned transport ships unprotected, or should he remain where he was and await orders? Reefcoal decided to remain at his station and await orders from Admiral Crutchley. Those orders, of course, would never come. Crutchley was at the conference with Turner, completely unaware that a battle was raging. The Northern Group continued on its northwestern course, patrolling as assigned. But what about the destroyer Patterson's warning? When the Northern Group ships received the warning message, it couldn't have come at a worse time. The ships were busy communicating with each other during a routine course change to the northwest. Radio circuits were occupied with navigation messages. Thus, Vincennes received the warning, but it was not passed to Captain Reefcoal. Quincy received it. Astoria never got the warning at all. In short, 10 minutes after the fight began, the Northern Group was in the same position as the Southern Group had been, unaware and unprepared for the enemy heading directly toward them. Thanks to confusion inherent in every naval battle, Mikawa's line had split into 2 parts. However, this actually gave the Japanese a significant advantage. The Iron Giant had transformed into 2 jaws. Between those jaws lay the unprepared Northern Group. Japanese ships prepared their torpedoes and closed in. They illuminated the Northern Group with searchlights, revealing American cruisers whose guns were still pointed forward. Through their binoculars, Japanese officers could see men running across the decks as battle stations were finally sounded. Even so, confusion still reigned aboard the American ships. Many Americans believed they were being illuminated by Allied ships. Vincennes began signaling repeatedly using her signal lamp. "Turn off those searchlights. We are friendly." While Vincennes frantically signaled, close splashes began falling near Astoria as Japanese ranging shots sought the proper distance. Astoria's gunners were quick to react, immediately returning fire toward the searchlights. But then the captain, who had just been awakened and rushed to the bridge, ordered ceasefire. Like many that night, he feared his ship was shelling Allied vessels. Soon, he was convinced otherwise and ordered his crew to resume fire. But this hesitation proved fatal. The delay allowed Chokai to deliver the first devastating hits on Astoria. successful hits continued to rain down on the American cruiser. Astoria's bow, deck, and bridge were hit in rapid succession. 2 of her 3 main gun turrets were hit and disabled after they attempted to return fire. Then the hangar was struck, and a fierce fire began. The Americans soon discovered a fatal weakness in their cruiser design. The float planes stored on the upper deck and in the hangar represented the ship's Achilles heel. Kerosene, oil, ammunition, and other flammable materials were concentrated in this exposed area. When hit by shells, these materials ignited and contributed significantly to feeding uncontrollable fires. Astoria became engulfed in flames that could not be extinguished. The burning cruiser narrowly avoided a collision with Quincy, which was suffering a similar fate. Astoria had become a burning wreck. The Japanese cruisers Aoba, Kako, and Kinugasa delivered the coup de grace, continuing to fire until the American ship was thoroughly crippled. The forward engine room was abandoned as fires and flooding made it untenable. The ship soon came to a stop. In total, Astoria was struck by numerous torpedoes and dozens of artillery shells. Quincy came under heavy and accurate gunfire from Aoba. Then the ship spotted new targets on her port side, the western part of Mikawa's divided formation. Quincy turned to starboard when lookouts spotted torpedoes sailing toward her through the water. She was eventually hit by 2 torpedoes from Tenryu. Soon, the cruiser was buried under a hail of fire. Her rear turret was disabled. The catapult was hit, and 5 aircraft stored aboard ignited, adding to the inferno. Quincy quickly became a burning hell. One of the most iconic photographs taken during the battle captures Quincy fighting for her life. From this image, viewers can understand just how close range this engagement was. Here we see Quincy burning and sinking stern first, fires raging across her length. Despite the terrible damage suffered, Quincy was able to defend herself. She fired 3 salvos at the Japanese. The last salvo scored hits on Chokai's bridge, nearly killing Admiral Mikawa and his staff officers. However, Quincy's own bridge was hit moments later, killing her captain. A moment after that, she lost all power as another torpedo struck her starboard side. Finally, approximately 54 hits were recorded on the burning cruiser. To give an idea of the fire intensity on these ships, the Japanese actually turned off their searchlights mid-battle. The burning American cruisers illuminated the battlefield so well that artificial light was no longer necessary. At the head of the northern group formation, Vincennes took hits right from the start of combat. First, she took 2 torpedo hits on her port side, deadly gifts from Chokai. Vincennes returned fire and managed to hit Kinugasa, inflicting light damage. But this was all the damage she would manage to inflict on the enemy. Vincennes found herself caught in a crossfire from both the eastern and western Japanese columns. Artillery shells began raining down from multiple directions. All of her main gun turrets were hit and disabled, testament to Japanese precision and gunnery skills. Another torpedo struck her port side. Then more hits followed in rapid succession. Shells struck the main steam lines, cutting off power. The firefighting systems were disabled. Main battery fire control was knocked out. A hit to the command tower severed ship communications. Like the other cruisers, Vincennes' hangar burst into flames. Rudder control failed. Electrical systems collapsed. The Northern Group's flagship was fighting desperately for survival. Later, it would be calculated that the ship was hit by approximately 74 shells. The Northern Group's destroyers played no significant role in the battle. Helm fired one salvo at what she thought was an enemy ship, then withdrew from the fight. Wilson fired at various enemy ships during the battle, but recorded no hits. The destroyers, like the cruisers, had been caught completely by surprise and never had the opportunity to coordinate an effective response. According to Mikawa's plan, the Japanese cruisers began leaving the area. Behind them, they left only devastation. 3 American cruisers were fighting for their lives, burning and sinking. The Australian cruiser Canberra was dead in the water. The southern and northern groups had been shattered. The only remaining obstacle for the Japanese flotilla was the destroyer Ralph Talbot, one of the picket ships that had failed to detect Mikawa's approach. Now, Ralph Talbot found herself engaged by 3 Japanese ships, the light cruisers Yubari and Tenryu, along with the heavy cruiser Furutaka. The destroyer returned fire courageously, but registered no hits on the enemy. In the brief firefight, Ralph Talbot was hit 6 times. Fortunately for her crew, a sudden rain squall swept across the area, obscuring the destroyer from Japanese view. This meteorological intervention saved Ralph Talbot from certain destruction. Around 2:20 in the morning, Admiral Mikawa ordered his ships to cease fire. The Battle of Savo Island was over. In approximately 37 minutes of combat, Mikawa's force had inflicted one of the worst defeats in United States naval history. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sinking, or would sink within hours. Approximately 1,000 Allied sailors were dead or would die from their wounds. Japanese losses were minimal, some damage to 3 ships, fewer than 40 men killed in the engagement itself. The victory was complete and devastating. But as Mikawa's ships formed up to withdraw through the slot, a crucial question remained. What should he do now? The Allied warships were destroyed. The transport ships lay undefended at anchor. Should he turn back and complete the destruction of the American invasion force? Or should he withdraw while he still had the cover of darkness? This decision would haunt Mikawa for the rest of his life. It would become one of the great what-ifs of the Pacific War. And it would be debated by historians for decades to come. An overwhelming victory had been achieved. American naval forces protecting the invasion had been destroyed. 4 heavy cruisers were sinking or fatally damaged. The Allied screening force had been shattered. From this complete tactical success emerged an opportunity to transform it into something even greater, a strategic victory that could cripple the entire American operation. The transport ships now lay uncovered and vulnerable to attack. These vessels contained the supplies, equipment, and reinforcements that the Marines ashore desperately needed. Without these transports, the American invasion force would be stranded on Guadalcanal with inadequate provisions. The entire operation could collapse. Admiral Mikawa faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Between approximately 2:15 and 2:23 in the morning, he had to choose between 2 starkly different courses of action. Should he return to the anchorage and destroy the transport ships? Or should he withdraw from the battlefield while he still had the advantage of darkness? Several compelling factors supported continuing the attack. First, Mikawa's flotilla still had substantial ammunition remaining to continue offensive operations. While exact figures vary in different accounts, his ships had expended a significant but not overwhelming portion of their main gun ammunition and torpedoes during the brief engagement. This remaining firepower was more than adequate to attack and sink the vulnerable, lightly armed transport ships. The Americans had loaded these vessels for cargo capacity, not combat. They would be almost defenseless against cruiser gunfire and torpedoes. Second, nothing now stood in Mikawa's way. The American forces that had been assigned to protect the transports had been destroyed. The cruisers were sinking. The destroyers had been scattered or damaged. No organized resistance remained. In short, if Mikawa decided to return and sink the transport ships, he would almost certainly be successful. The transports would be sitting ducks, unable to maneuver effectively or defend themselves against a force of heavy cruisers. The mathematics of the situation seemed to favor attack. Mikawa commanded 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. Against this force, the Americans could offer virtually no resistance. A few destroyers might attempt to intervene, but they would be overwhelmed. Mikawa could methodically destroy the transport fleet, denying the Americans the supplies they needed to sustain their beachhead. This was an opportunity that might never come again. However, compelling reasons not to attack also existed. The first was relatively minor, but still significant. A hit scored on Mikawa's flagship Chokai had struck the chart room, destroying charts and maps that Mikawa needed for navigating the Sound. Without these navigational aids, maneuvering in the confined waters would be more difficult and dangerous. But this was a manageable problem, not a decisive factor. The biggest problem was time. Dawn was not far away. Mikawa's staff estimated that it would take considerable time to reform the scattered flotilla and turn course back into the Sound. His ships had become dispersed during the battle, with different divisions operating somewhat independently. Gathering them back into formation would require time and careful maneuvering in darkness. Then additional time would be needed to reach the transport ships and conduct the attack. This meant that, by the time an attack could be completed, dawn would be approaching or already breaking. Mikawa would have little or no darkness remaining as protection. If he attacked the transports, he wouldn't be able to retreat under the cover of darkness. Dawn would find his ships still in the Sound, or just beginning their withdrawal up the slot. This would make him extremely vulnerable in daylight. Mikawa would certainly face attacks from American carrier aircraft once the sun rose. He knew all too well what aircraft could inflict on surface ships that lacked air cover. He had just witnessed the devastating effectiveness of air power during the previous day's raids. Japanese bombers at Naval had suffered catastrophic losses attacking the American fleet. Now his own ships would be on the receiving end of such attacks. Without air cover of his own, without the ability to call on friendly fighters for protection, his cruisers would be exposed to potentially devastating airstrikes. The likely result would be heavy losses, possibly even the absolute destruction of his force. American carrier aircraft would have hours to locate and attack his ships. Dive bombers and torpedo planes would strike from multiple directions. His anti-aircraft guns would provide some defense, but against determined, repeated attacks, the outcome seemed inevitable. He might sink the transports, but at the cost of losing most or all of his own ships. At this point, in his analysis, the factors seemed balanced. 2 major arguments favoured attack: adequate ammunition and no opposition. 2 major arguments opposed attack: damaged navigation charts and the time problem that would expose him to air attack. The decision could go either way. But getting into Mikawa's position requires understanding other factors that likely influenced his decision to retreat. Before leaving Rabaul, Mikawa had spoken with the commander of the Naval General Staff, Admiral Osami Nagano. Nagano had emphasized something crucial to Mikawa. Japan could not afford losses due to its inferior industrial strength compared to the United States. Ships that were lost could not be replaced, at least not quickly enough to matter. The Americans could build new ships faster than Japan could sink them. But Japan's shipbuilding capacity was far more limited. This warning carried particular weight for Mikawa at this moment. He was commanding roughly 1/3 of all the heavy cruisers in the Japanese Navy. Losing these ships would be a catastrophic blow to Japan's naval strength. Heavy cruisers took years to build and required enormous resources. They couldn't be quickly replaced. Was destroying American transports worth risking approximately 1/3 of Japan's heavy cruiser force? This was the question weighing on Mikawa's mind. Moreover, the army commander had boasted about how his forces would handle the Americans. Mikawa's mission had been to deal with the American Navy, and he had accomplished that mission brilliantly. Now the infantry would handle the Marines who had landed. The army had promised to drive the Americans off the island. If the army could fulfill this promise, then sinking the transport ships became somewhat less urgent. Why risk his precious cruisers if the army was going to eliminate the American beachhead anyway? Additionally, Mikawa was an old-school commander who adhered to traditional concepts of naval warfare, particularly the concept of command of the seas. This doctrine asserted that the most important objective was destroying enemy warships. Warships represented the true measure of naval power. By destroying the enemy's warships, you gained naval dominance. Naval dominance would give you control of the surrounding waters. Control of the waters would ultimately mean control of the island. Mikawa likely thought he had accomplished precisely this. He had destroyed the American cruisers. The transport ships were now unprotected. Without their protective screen of warships, these transports would have to withdraw or face destruction. Admiral Turner would have no choice but to pull back. The invasion would be hampered, even if not completely stopped. From this perspective, Mikawa's question became clear. Why needlessly risk his flotilla when he had already achieved the essential objective? He had won command of the seas around Guadalcanal. The rest would follow naturally from this victory. Better to preserve his force for future operations than to gamble everything on destroying transports. This was Mikawa's dilemma during those critical 8 minutes between 2:15 and 2:23. It's worth asking ourselves to put ourselves in Mikawa's position. Which option would we choose? Would we return and increase our victory by destroying the transport ships, knowing this could cripple the American invasion, but simultaneously risk losing precious cruisers to what seemed like certain air attacks come dawn? Ships that represented roughly 1/3 of our nation's heavy cruiser strength? Ships that could never be replaced quickly enough to matter in a long war? Or would we choose to be satisfied with what we had already accomplished? Not tempt fate by pressing our luck too far. Sail home with our victorious fleet intact, facing less risk of devastating air attacks. Accept the brilliant tactical victory we had won without gambling it all for something greater. Mikawa consulted with his staff. We can imagine the discussion aboard Chokai's bridge in those crucial minutes. Officers presenting arguments for both courses of action. The awareness that this decision would shape the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The knowledge that lives and ships hung in the balance. The pressure of making a choice with incomplete information in the darkness before dawn. At 2:23 in the morning, Mikawa made his decision. He chose to play it safe. He ordered the retreat. His ships would withdraw up the slot while darkness still protected them. They would not press their attack against the transports. The tactical victory would remain a tactical victory, not transformed into the strategic catastrophe for the Americans that it might have become. The entire irony of this decision would become apparent only later. The American carriers that Mikawa feared so much were, by this time, already long gone from the combat zone. Vice Admiral Fletcher, in one of his most controversial decisions of the war, had decided to withdraw his carriers the previous evening. Fletcher was concerned about his fuel state and the risk of Japanese air attacks. He had pulled his carriers back, removing them from the immediate area. They were steaming away from Guadalcanal, even as Mikawa was making his decision. Thus, if Mikawa had risked everything and attacked the transport ships, his flotilla would likely have escaped undamaged during the day. No American carrier aircraft would have found him. No devastating airstrikes would have materialized. He could have destroyed the transports and withdrawn successfully. This remains one of the greatest what-ifs of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. But who could blame Mikawa for his decision? We can look at everything in hindsight, with perfect knowledge of what Fletcher was doing and where the carriers were located. Mikawa had to make his decision based on the information available to him at that moment. He had to plan for what might happen, not what he hoped would happen. He had to assume the worst-case scenario, that American carriers were nearby and would launch devastating strikes at dawn. In post-war years, Mikawa reflected on this decision in various interviews. He defended his choice, stating that if he had known the Americans would never be pushed off the island by the Japanese army, and if he had known that American carriers were actually retreating rather than preparing to attack, his decision would have been different. But based on the information available to him that night, he didn't attack. And he felt, even years later, that he had made the correct decision given what he knew at the time. The historical debate over this decision continues to this day. Some historians argue that Mikawa failed to grasp the operation's true strategic importance. He didn't see the unique opportunity that had been presented to him. He could have struck a blow that might have ended the American offensive before it truly began. This criticism has merit, but it's also somewhat unfair to Mikawa. Mikawa didn't have a crystal ball that would tell him how important Guadalcanal would become. He couldn't foresee the 6 months of brutal fighting that would follow. He couldn't know that this island would become the turning point of the Pacific War. Most of us know this only through historical hindsight. Mikawa had to make his decision in the moment, in the darkness, with incomplete information and tremendous pressure. Regardless of these considerations, historians continue to debate the significance of the opportunity Mikawa had. The naval historian Mark Still has argued forcefully about the missed opportunity. In his assessment, Mikawa couldn't know it then, but he had just squandered the Imperial Navy's best chance to deliver a crushing blow to the first American offensive in the Pacific. Still judges that it's hard to imagine Americans would have held the island after the destruction of their transport ship flotilla and the supplies aboard. In this view, the destruction of American transport ships would have been worth sacrificing Mikawa's entire flotilla. This assessment, while compelling as a counterfactual argument, reflects what might have been rather than what was certain. Losing 5 heavy cruisers would have been a terrible blow to Japan. But some historians argue that forcing the Americans to abandon their first major offensive could have been worth that price. It might have delayed the American advance significantly. It would have given Japan precious time to strengthen its defenses and potentially negotiate a more favorable end to the war. With this historical perspective, debate continues over whether Mikawa made the correct decision. The question will likely never be fully resolved. What remains clear is this: Mikawa won one of the most devastating tactical victories in naval history. But by choosing caution over boldness, he may have missed the chance to turn that tactical triumph into a strategic victory that could have changed the course of the entire Pacific War. At approximately 2:20 in the morning, Admiral Mikawa ordered his ships to withdraw. The Japanese flotilla formed up and headed north through the slot, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would shock even hardened naval veterans. In the darkness, 4 mortally wounded cruisers fought their final battles against fire, flooding, and the inexorable pull of the sea. Quincy went first. Torn apart by dozens of shell hits and multiple torpedo strikes, the American cruiser had been transformed into a floating inferno. Her bow rose skyward as water flooded the stern compartments, and within minutes of Mikawa's departure, she rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. Approximately 390 men died with her, or in the oil-slicked waters surrounding the sinking ship. Vincennes, flagship of the Northern Group, survived only slightly longer. Every main gun turret disabled, engine rooms flooding, fires raging across multiple decks, the cruiser had been systematically destroyed by accurate Japanese gunnery. Around 2:50, after her crew had done everything humanly possible to save their ship, Vincennes capsized and sank. The sea claimed approximately 342 of her crew. Dawn revealed Canberra still afloat, though barely. The Australian cruiser sat motionless and listing heavily, her port side riddled with shell holes, fires still burning despite hours of damage control efforts. Some observers thought she might be salvageable, but Admiral Turner faced a brutal calculation. His transports needed to withdraw immediately, Japanese air raids would resume with daylight, and without carrier air cover, his ships were sitting ducks. He couldn't wait for lengthy salvage operations. The order went out: if Canberra couldn't steam under her own power, she would be scuttled. American destroyers moved in and fired torpedoes into the crippled cruiser. At 8 o'clock that morning, Canberra finally slipped beneath the surface. 84 Australian sailors had perished in the battle, and their ship now joined Quincy and Vincennes at the bottom of what would soon be called Iron Bottom Sound. Astoria's crew fought the longest and hardest to save their vessel. Throughout the morning, damage control parties battled the flames that had engulfed the hangar and aircraft facilities. They managed to contain some fires, extinguished others, and for hours it seemed they might actually succeed. But the damage was too extensive, the flooding too severe, the fires too deeply rooted in the ship's structure. That afternoon, with the ship's list growing worse and flames gaining the upper hand, the order came to abandon ship. At 12:15, Astoria rolled over and sank, taking approximately 235 sailors with her. The butcher's bill from this single night was staggering. 4 heavy cruisers destroyed, 3 American, 1 Australian. Chicago damaged, though she would survive. 2 destroyers also sustained damage. Casualty figures vary slightly depending on which sources are consulted and how later losses are counted, but approximately 1,000 to 1,100 Allied sailors died in or as a result of this engagement. Another 700 were wounded. This represented one of the worst defeats for Allied naval forces in the Pacific War. The scale of destruction compressed into less than 40 minutes of combat was almost unprecedented. While Marine casualties during the entire 6-month Guadalcanal campaign would number in the hundreds, naval losses from this single night approached or exceeded those figures, a testament to the devastating efficiency of modern naval warfare. Japanese losses stood in stark contrast. 3 ships sustained damage: Chokai hit in the bridge area, Kinugasa and Aoba with minor damage. None were seriously impaired or put out of action. Casualties numbered approximately 35 killed and 51 wounded. Though Mikawa hadn't destroyed the transports, transforming his tactical victory into strategic triumph, the engagement still represented the greatest Japanese surface fleet victory of the entire war. As Mikawa's ships approached Rabaul, the magnitude of their achievement became clear. They had engaged superior Allied forces and destroyed them with minimal cost. The welcome at port was jubilant, the victory celebrated throughout the fleet. Mikawa's bold gambit had succeeded brilliantly, or so it seemed. The celebration proved premature. On August 10th, Lieutenant Commander John Moore aboard the submarine S-44 was patrolling near New Ireland when he spotted ships on the horizon. Identifying them as elements of the 6th Cruiser Division returning to Kavieng, Moore manoeuvred into attack position and fired 4 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kako. 3 struck home, tearing massive holes in the cruiser's hull. Within minutes, Kako was sinking, her crew abandoning ship as water flooded the engine rooms. Approximately 68 men went down with her, while most of the crew was rescued. One of the 5 heavy cruisers that had won the great victory now rested at the bottom of the sea. American submarines had delivered swift and painful retaliation. The loss of Kako demonstrated that even in triumph, Japanese ships remained vulnerable. But the cruelest chapter was yet to play out. The destroyer Jarvis, torpedoed during the air raid on August 8th, and then encountered by Mikawa's force as it entered the Sound, was attempting to reach Australia for repairs. Limping south at roughly 7 knots, her crew had performed miracles keeping her afloat. Her radio was dead, leaving her unable to communicate. Worse, the crew had jettisoned the lifeboats to lighten ship and improve stability. A sound damage control decision that would have fatal consequences. A Japanese airstrike heading for Iron Bottom Sound spotted the crippled destroyer. Reconnaissance aircraft misidentified her as a cruiser, and the strike was redirected to this new target. Around noon, 16 Betty bombers found Jarvis crawling across the ocean. Her anti-aircraft guns opened fire and, incredibly, the destroyer shot down 2 aircraft with a 3rd crashing later from battle damage. The crew fought with extraordinary courage, but they were overwhelmed. Wave after wave of bombers attacked until Jarvis, already heavily damaged from earlier combat, finally succumbed. She sank with all hands, approximately 233 sailors lost with no survivors. Admiral Turner's withdrawal from Savo Sound on August 9th has sometimes been portrayed as panic in the face of Mikawa's victory. This interpretation misses the crucial point. The decision to withdraw had been made before Mikawa ever entered the Sound, driven by Admiral Fletcher's controversial choice to pull his carriers back the previous evening. Without carrier air cover, Turner's transports and remaining escorts were dangerously exposed to Japanese air attack. The previous days had demonstrated how effective these raids could be. Ironically, the conference that Admiral Crutchley attended, causing him to miss the entire battle, was convened specifically to discuss Fletcher's departure. Turner faced an impossible dilemma. His transports hadn't finished unloading the supplies that 17,000 Marines desperately needed. But without air protection, continuing operations in the Sound meant risking systematic destruction of his entire fleet. The choice, though agonizing, was clear. By evening on August 9th, Savo Sound stood empty. Behind the departing ships, the Marines found themselves in a precarious position. They had secured the airfield on Guadalcanal and the positions on Tulagi, but with far fewer supplies than planned. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, construction equipment, much of what they needed remained in ships' holds, now steaming away toward safer waters. The Marines would have to make do with captured Japanese supplies, careful rationing, and whatever could be flown in once Henderson Field became operational. The Battle of Savo Island had exposed multiple catastrophic failures in Allied operations. Critical intelligence had been delayed for hours when minutes mattered most. Ship identification errors led to fatally flawed assessments. Divided command authority created gaps that the enemy exploited. Excessive confidence in untested technology, radar operated by inexperienced personnel, proved unfounded. Exhausted crews at reduced manning couldn't respond quickly enough when surprise struck. These lessons, written in blood in the waters around Savo Island, would drive fundamental changes in American naval operations. Communications would be overhauled, radar training intensified, night fighting tactics developed, command structures clarified. The Americans would learn to respect Japanese capabilities rather than assume their own superiority. But the education was expensive, 4 cruisers and over 1,000 lives. The waters around Guadalcanal would witness many more battles over the coming months. So many ships from both sides would be sunk that sailors gave the area a new name, Iron Bottom Sound, acknowledging all the steel now resting on the ocean floor. The 4 Allied cruisers from Savo Island would be joined by numerous vessels from both navies as the campaign raged on for 6 brutal months. On that morning of August 9th, 1942, as the sun rose over oil slicks and floating debris marking where proud warships had died, several truths became inescapable. The United States Navy had suffered a devastating defeat. Japanese excellence in night combat was no myth. It was deadly reality backed by years of training and superior tactics. Underestimating the enemy carried a terrible price. And the war in the Pacific, far from being a quick march to victory, would prove to be a long, brutal struggle, consuming ships and lives on a scale few had imagined. Savo Island stood as proof of all these harsh truths. The battle would be studied for decades, analysed for its lessons, remembered for its cost. 4 cruisers rested on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, eternal monuments to the night when everything went wrong for the Allied fleet. The campaign for Guadalcanal, which had begun with such optimism just 2 days earlier, would continue for months. But it would continue in the shadow of this disaster, with both sides understanding that victory in the Pacific would be measured not in weeks, but in years, not in easy triumphs, but in hard-won yards of blood-soaked jungle and contested ocean. The Battle of Savo Island delivered an unmistakable message to American forces. Japanese surface ships, particularly at night, were formidable opponents, backed by years of intensive training. This engagement proved to be merely the opening act in a prolonged struggle for the waters around Guadalcanal. So many vessels from both sides would eventually rest on the ocean floor that sailors christened the area Iron Bottom Sound, a name that would endure long after the guns fell silent. The campaign had barely begun. Ahead lay the battles of Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Santa Cruz, the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Tassafaronga, 6 months of brutal naval warfare that would consume dozens of major and minor warships, along with numerous aircraft from both navies. The slot became the most fiercely contested waterway of the Pacific War. What made Savo Island particularly devastating wasn't simply the ships lost or the lives taken. Rather, it was how the disaster unfolded. Complete surprise, achieved despite reconnaissance spotting Mikawa hours earlier. A communication system that delayed critical intelligence for many hours when minutes mattered desperately. Forces divided and defeated in detail. The commander absent at a conference. Exhausted crews at partially manned battle stations. American overconfidence colliding headlong with Japanese excellence in night combat. Every advantage the Allies possessed had been squandered through a cascading series of failures. One mystery has emerged in recent decades regarding Canberra's fate. Some survivors and researchers have suggested the Australian cruiser may have been struck by torpedoes from Bagley, which fired at Japanese ships during the battle. Battle diagrams show that if Bagley maintained her assigned station, friendly fire would have been unlikely. However, if Bagley was behind station, as some analysts claim, her torpedoes could conceivably have struck Canberra around 1:47. This theory remains disputed and unproven, but if true, the bitter irony would be inescapable. The notoriously problematic Mark 15 torpedoes working as designed, but hitting an Allied ship. Beyond statistics and tactical analysis lies the human dimension. Over 1,000 families received telegrams informing them that sons, husbands, fathers, brothers would never return home. Men drowned in burning oil or were trapped below decks as their ships capsized. Some died at battle stations they had barely reached after being jolted from exhausted sleep. Survivors swam through flames in shark-infested waters, watching shipmates disappear into the darkness, carrying trauma that would haunt them for decades. 4 heavy cruisers rest at the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound as silent testimony. They bear witness to communication failures, intelligence breakdowns, overconfidence, meeting superior skill, and what happens when every advantage gets squandered. They remind us of the cost of underestimating an enemy. In naval warfare, as in all warfare, victory is often decided long before the first shot is fired. Intelligence, communication, preparation, respect for the opponent, these determine outcomes. Mikawa understood this instinctively. Turner learned it at terrible cost. That remains the enduring legacy of Savo Island, one of the worst naval defeats in American history, compressed into a single devastating night.